Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is part two. I'm going to scoot over here so I'm not blinded. This is part two of Fostering Change. This is the many faces of God. And tonight we'll see the evolution of Jewish theology across history. As in all religions, Jewish theology has grown and evolved in many varied and interesting directions. Part three, which will be next month, that's on Tuesday, May 16th. So stay tuned for that. Just look in our event calendar if you don't remember the date. And we're going to have a small reception after that talk on anti-Semitism here in this room. So I'm very happy to introduce again Rabbi Gavi Ruit, who was ordained by the Hebrew Union College of Los Angeles and did her post-ordination graduate work in medieval and modern Jewish thought at HUC Cincinnati. Her approach to the rabbinate is both scholarly and deeply spiritual, and her advanced study of Jewish theology, as well as her background in psychology, have added nuance and texture to her teaching. Much of Rabbi Ruit's writing and teaching focuses on Jewish ethics, including sexual ethics, and her recent book, The Story of Rape and Rape Myth in Jewish Tradition, has been praised in both rabbinic and academic circles. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi Gavi Ruit to the library.
Thank you. Did I miss something? Got it. It's lovely to see you all again. As some of you have been in classes with me in other forums, will not be surprised when you hear these words, which is, this is one of my favorite topics to teach. So theology is kind of my reason for being as a rabbi. In rabbinical school, I was required to write a personal theology. See, I'm filling while you do this. I was required to write a personal theology where I delved very deeply into the theological evolution of Judaism to construct my own theology. And I found that moment to be transformative. It changed the direction of my rabbinate. I went on to graduate school to work on medieval and modern thought and theology. And it's been an integral part of my teaching ever since. So it's a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and you will get a sense of how I feel about it as we go forward. Mark, is this the way the lights are supposed to be? It's good. Can we turn these down a little bit? We can try, but is it possible to turn the sort of general lights down a little bit?
I think when I do that, he's having a tough time recording.
Okay. It's just hard to see the screen. Can you record?
Start, but I can record.
You can record. Let's go with that because it's kind of a pain if y'all can't see the slides. So, okay. So the name of this class is The Many Faces of God, the Evolution of Jewish Theology. And I want to start by defining terms because it always helps to be speaking the same language, knowing what we're talking about. So the first question is, what is theology? In fact, I'm going to go back there a second. Any ideas on what, if you had to define theology, how you would define it? Words about God. Okay, great. Anybody else? Is someone trumpeting? Okay, is it just, I'm hearing it, nobody else? Okay, just wanted to make sure that, do a little reality testing in that moment to make sure I wasn't going verkauft there. Okay, so looking at what is theology. So theo means relates to God or deities, and ology is the study of. So theology, if you put those two together, should be the study of God or deities. But what the heck does that mean? How do we study God? Well, it's always good to look at how this term, ology, is used in other terms to get a sense. So in biology, which is the study of life, we study biology by observing the world around us, whether it's under a microscope or in the immediate world. In psychology, it's the study of the mind, and we study psychology by observing behavior and making inferences about the mind. But in both cases, observation is an integral part of what ology is supposed to mean. So theology brings the question, how do we observe God? And the answer is, we don't. Theology is the only ology out of the groups that doesn't really fall into this observation study model. The way that I have always seen theology in general terms is it's how we talk about that feeling of divinity we have in our kishkas, right? That sense that there is something more, and we put words to it. And those words are how religion develops, whether they were paganistic religions before the rise of monotheism. Humanity has, throughout its entire existence, had a drive towards connecting with and describing that sense of divinity. So that's the framework for theology generally. But Jewish theology in specific, I like to describe it as the why of the what that we do. And what I mean by this. So from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple and the rise of the rabbinic era, we Jews have been doing, the what of what we Jews have been doing has been essentially the same. The service structure was put in place over 2,000 years ago, and it is the same service structure that every Jewish denomination uses today. There are variations in that, Reform shortens things up, and Orthodox services can feel like they go on a very long time, though they are lovely. I enjoy them thoroughly. There are differences between the amount of Hebrew that is used and how vernacular, but basically at its base, whether you're Reform, Conservative, Renewal, Orthodox, whatever, we are doing the same things. We are celebrating the same holidays. We are using the same service structure. We are praying the same prayers. So the what is very consistent, but the why of what we do has changed dramatically across history. The why that we pray certain prayers 1,000 years ago is a very different why than different congregations do today. And so the evolution of theology shows us the evolution of that why to the what. And I think theology is so important because a lot of Jews, and as a rabbi I say this all the time, a lot of Jews know the what very well. They know, to bow at Aleinu, and they know to turn and bow at the last stanza of Lachado D. But they might not know, actually most Jews don't know, that when you turn to bow with Lachado D, the theology behind that is the unification of divinity that happens one day a week and is the culmination of a cosmic drama that is played out throughout all of Kabbalat Shabbat. And anybody who's taken my recent Kabbalat Shabbat class this should sound reasonably familiar. So this is why I think theology is important, because understanding the why of what we do brings more meaningfulness to what we do. If all you do is bow at the end of Lachado D, you're not part of that integral, beautiful drama to the same extent that you would be if you did know. So that's why I think theology is important. A couple of other key terms, and these are going to be very key terms. There are two ways of viewing divinity, and these two ways of viewing divinity are kind of on a spectrum. Nobody falls entirely in one field or the other, but there's a lot of tension between these two ways. So the idea of immanence is that God exists in and throughout the created world, and specifically that God is close and personal. God is the God that you pray to and ask for specific things and know that you're going to get a specific answer. The transcendent way of looking at God sees God as outside of humanity's full experience, perception, or grasp. God is distant and not personal. And these two approaches to viewing God are consistent through, or not consistent, show themselves throughout all religions, especially the Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But they're always in tension, right? If you see God as truly personal, having a discussion with someone who sees God as entirely impersonal makes for a tension. And that tension plays out throughout theology across time. And it's part of the reason that theology evolves. Because what happens is there may be a heavy dominance on rationalistic, transcendent God who's distant, and we're just going to think about God as an intellect. Here I'm talking about the Middle Ages, Maimonides and Saadia Gaon. We will get to them. Well, a lot of folks felt that God to be very unsatisfying, a real sense of disconnection. And so there was a real push and a resistance. And part of the reason you see a tremendous rise in Lurianic Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic movement is pushing back against the rationalism and the distance of God that you saw in the Middle Ages. So changes in theology happen to a certain degree because it's like a spectrum. Like we're over here in transcendent, and folks are very committed to that, but many people are finding it very unsatisfying and feeling disaffected. And so they'll start moving over here. And over here would be the Chassidut movement, the Chassidut movement. Is anybody familiar with Chassidut? Okay, we will get there. You will be more familiar by the time we are done today. All right. So those are our terms. Before I get into the meat and potatoes of tonight, any questions about terms, about immanence and transcendence, theology generally? Okay. So evolution in theology begins in the Hebrew Bible itself. For those of you who don't know, the Tanakh is another term for the Hebrew Bible. It's Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So it's Torah, the prophets, and the writings. That's how you get that word Tanakh. But in the Tanakh, divinity moves from a place of complete immanence to a place of qualified transcendence. And I'll show you how that works. So this is from Genesis 3. I know I'm very annoying in how much I pace, but I assure you pacing actually helps me think and teach. So here in Genesis 3, we hear so a little preamble to this. So Adam and Eve are told that they are not allowed to eat from one tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Serpent dupes Eve into eating of the apple. Eve gives Adam the apple. They both eat the apple. Their eyes are opened and they realize they are naked. And that's how we start here. They heard the sound of God Adonai moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day. And the human and his wife hid from God Adonai among the trees of the garden. God Adonai called out to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" He replied, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat of the tree from which I had forbidden you to eat?" The human said, "The woman you put at my side, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." And God Adonai said to the woman, "What is this that you've done?" And the woman replied, the serpent duped me, and I ate." So here we have a completely close, personal, parental even God, right? A God who not only knows what you're doing, but asks you questions and drills down on your answers, right? This is a very close God. That shifts a little bit when we get to the rest of Torah. God starts to become more and more removed from the closeness. And we see this here in Exodus 3. Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The messenger of Adonai appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. Just a note here. A messenger, right? We're not talking about God directly, came out in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, "I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up?" When Adonai saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." He answered, "Hineni, here I am." And God said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." So here we have God is still talking with Moses, so there's certainly an imminence there. But Moses never gets to see God face to face, as Adam and Eve and Abraham and Noah, they all got to walk around, walk and talk and with divinity. In this case, God has become slightly more transcendent. It's only through illusions, like a burning bush, and one could say auditory hallucinations, because something's talking to you, but you don't see what it is. Do you get the difference between those two scenes? How one is truly imminent and one is much less so? Okay. So by the time we get to the prophets, God is quite opaque. God only appears through dreams, visions, and auditory illusions. This, I want to say this is from Micah. It is from Micah. The word of the Lord that came to Micah. So in this case, all we get is some sound, some auditory sound. The word of the Lord came to Micah, the Morashite, who prophesied concerning Samaria and Jerusalem in the reigns of kings Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah. "Listen, all you peoples, give heed, O earth, and all that it holds, and let my Lord God be your accuser." The prophets were very much into being the accuser, giving the accuser message. "My Lord from his holy abode. For lo, the Lord is coming forth from his dwelling place. He will come down and stride upon the heights of the earth. The mountains shall melt under him, and the valleys burst open like wax before a fire, like water cascading down a slope." So in this case, God's no longer talking. God's being talked about. The messenger is entirely the prophet. So here we have this another step of separation between divinity and the people Israel. So we're getting more and more distance. And then in the writings, in some cases, God is completely absent. In the book of Esther, God is completely hidden. I mean, that's part of what we rabbis do a lot of spiels on shticks. I spiel, I'm thinking Purim. Sticks on God being hidden, and that's why masks are such a thing in Purim. Is that it's something that rabbis often talk about, because God isn't around in the book of Esther, and yet it's still a book that is very important in the Hebrew Bible. So rabbis for thousands of years have been trying to explain why God is not part of this story. And rabbis have come up with this idea that God is hidden like everybody else is behind masks in the book. In the book of Ruth, God is mostly absent. Like, the entire story has no reference to divinity at all until a little kind of summary statement at the end of the book that this was for God's benefit. I don't remember the verbiage completely. But we've got these two major books that are two major books about two major holidays, right? The book of Ruth is Shavuot, the book of Esther is Purim. And in both cases, we have really a non-present divinity. And in the rest of the writings, whether it be less so in Psalms, but in Proverbs, in many of the other writings, God is talked about as a concept, as a construct. Now, think about the difference between the first story I showed you, where Adam and Eve are in relationship with divinity. They're having a tiff. They're so much in relationship. And by the writings, God is really a concept, as opposed to being an active participant in the stories that are being discussed. That makes sense? So even within the Hebrew Bible itself, we have this incredible evolution from an entirely immanent God to a largely transcendent one, just within this one book, which I think sort of typifies the type of evolution that happens across time. Before we move into this big shift that happens after the destruction of the temple, are there any questions about the Hebrew Bible in terms of theology? Oh, okay. Okay, so thing about the second temple. So the second temple, the destruction of the second temple changed everything. It was made for an entirely, a huge paradigm shift. So while the temple stood, the only way to access the holiness of divinity was through the priesthood. Joe Shlomo brings his little bull calf to be sacrificed. The priest sacrifices it, and Joe Shlomo gets the holiness benefit, like what's the opposite of a demerit? Like the holiness in his bank account from the act of bringing a beast to be slaughtered. That was it. That was how holiness was accessed. But with the destruction of the temple meant that Jews had no way to access holiness. And so they had to innovate. They had to find another way. And they did. The reason that we have, just any Jews today have such a, I shouldn't say any Jews, the rabbis, so I struggle. My relationship with the rabbis of the Talmud became very disharmonious while I was writing my book, because the misogyny was prolific throughout their stories or their commentaries on Dina. And I, as a woman who was writing about rape myth and Jewish tradition, I found that very much a struggle. But I cannot, and I think anyone who is knowledgeable cannot, discount the way in which the rabbis of the rabbinic era allowed for Judaism and the Jewish people to continue. We would have ceased to exist with the destruction of the temple without their theological innovations. And they did some doozies. So one of the things that they did was they democratized holiness. Remember, holiness up until the destruction of the temple was only accessible through the priests, through the Kohanim, through the sacrificial system. But Rabbinic Judaism developed a system where everyone, not just priests, had access to holiness through their behavior, through mitzvot. Joe Shlomo didn't have to, put all his money into the calf in order to attain holiness. He could light candles on Shabbat or have his wife do them. He could make sure that he ate meat that was ritually sacrificed. He could maintain the ethical code and halakha that was developed out of the holiness code, which is Leviticus 19. There were many ways to access holiness because of these innovations. The focus on mitzvot is largely a rabbinic a rabbinic expansion. It began as a sort of philosophic approach, began to get sort of energy behind it during the late Second Temple period. The Pharisees were the ones who were proto-rabbis, and they started this idea of democratizing holiness, but it really wasn't until the destruction of the temple, and there was this huge void created that the rabbis had something from the Pharisees. They had something that they could fill that void with. And what they filled it with were mitzvot. And from there, halakha, the evolution of Jewish law, just grew like wildfire. It exploded after the destruction of the temple. So the rabbis used the timing and language of the temple service. So the temple used to sacrifice during 3 services of a day. The morning was shachrit, and most of us do shachrit, morning. If you go to shul on Saturday mornings, you're going to a shachrit service. That was the name that the priests had used for their morning sacrifice. So what they essentially did was take the language and the timing of how holiness was accessed and reframed it, gave it a new why. We no longer, remember the why of the what that we do, the why had been we do this sacrificial system in order to attain holiness, or we attain holiness through the sacrificial system. Here, we now can attain holiness through our behavior. And the rabbi seized on this period of sort of void in order to fill it. And they did this in a big way. They refocused the locus of power from the priesthood to the rabbinate. And one of the ways that they did that was in a part of the Mishnah known as Pirkei Avot. Anybody familiar with Pirkei Avot? It's the ethics of our fathers is the term for it. And it's basically an entire tractate in the Talmud that's dedicated to the ethics of the fathers, ethical, moral behavior in the world. And Perkei Avot begins it begins the entire section with this little bit here. They're describing how Torah was received. Moses received Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around Torah. What's missing in this transmission of Torah? Anybody see it? I'm sorry? Oh, people. Well, they weren't all that interested in the people. So that they were much more about, the rabbis were very much an elitist group. The priesthood is completely not even acknowledged. So the priesthood that had been this integral part of worship and holiness, the rabbis kind of step over the priesthood and go, we, the men of the great assembly, is the rabbis, the rabbis of that period were the men of the great assembly. So they are saying that from the prophets, the rabbis received Torah. Therefore, they're establishing their lineage of credibility in terms of being able to pass judgments about legalistic issues around Torah. It's a huge power grab. It was very subtly done, really. It seems like if you didn't know that there was this entire framework that had existed for a couple of thousand years and only ended because a temple was sacked, you would think that this was just natural. Of course, the rabbis received Torah from the prophets. I find that fascinating. I find it really kind of an interesting power move. But, and at the time that this was written, there was no guarantee that the rabbis would win out the day. So at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, and before the Second Temple was sacked by a couple hundred years, actually, there were factions within Judaism that were sort of vying for power. The Sadducees, which was the priesthood, the Pharisees, which were the proto-rabbis, the Essenes were the monks. There were also Zealots, smaller, very violent group. There was all these folks that wanted supremacy and power over Jewish tradition and how things were going to work. And the rabbis put forth this statement: we're the ones. We're the ones who have the authority to make decisions about holiness. There was no guarantee that they would win. It took 500 years before before rabbinic Judaism got solidified and became intractable. It was about 500 years. It was iffy for about 300 years whether they would win out or not. So we could have had a very different way of doing Judaism if the rabbis hadn't won the day. Okay, so rabbinic Judaism were the original reformers. And they had a specific focus that was very legalistic and in many ways very transcendent, in that what the rabbis were concerned about in the Talmud was making legal decisions, having the authority to make legal decisions about how it was appropriate to live your life as a Jew. And this becomes an issue over time, that tension that I talked about earlier, about people resisting one focus or the other. The legalistic focus of the rabbis becomes an issue. I'll give you a short story here. In the Talmud, there is a story about one rabbi who was a minority opinion. He had an opinion about how a an oven was supposed to be koshered. Nobody agreed with him. And he said, if I'm right, then the carob trees will move. And the carob tree picked up and moved 20 feet, and replanted itself. And the rest of the rabbis said, we don't care about carob trees. That you can make that happen is not our problem. And he said, okay, if I am right, I will make the river run the other way. And the river quickly runs the other way. Again, the rest of the rabbis go, that is not a legal deciding factor. Finally, he said, if I am right, then the walls of this Beit Midrash will close in. And they start closing in. And the rest of the people say, well, that's still not kosher legal reasoning, but stop, because you're going to crush us all. And then the walls stop at an angle, and a bat kol, a small voice, that is the voice of divinity, calls out, your colleague is right. I'm saying your colleague because I can't remember the rabbi's name. Rabbi so-and-so is correct. And the story ends with the rest of the rabbis saying, a voice is not a legal reasoning power. And then it ends with God laughing that his children had surpassed him. So that conveys the attitude of the rabbis. The rabbis saw their legal reasoning as being the most important holy function, whether you agree with that or not. So much of the rabbinic literature is dedicated to defining and expanding on this legal reasoning, on the halakha. And eventually, other Jewish theologies developed to push back on this heavy legal focus. Just think about it. Most of us, when we go to shul or when we pray, we're looking for connection to the divine, a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves. And it's really tough to feel that sort of immense connection when you're kibitzing about, how to kosher an oven, right? That doesn't have a very satisfying spiritual salve to it. So folks started resisting this kind of heavy, strictly legal focus. Okay. Any questions, thoughts about the rabbinic period? Yes?
So, with the focus on, would it be safe to say that the focus during that era where so much was dealt with, was it practical? Was it like day to day, like you said?
Yeah.
Kosher in the oven, or how many? There was always livestock.
I'll give you a perfect one. So in Judaism, you're not supposed to mix meat and milk. Rabbis are very practical and understood that there were times when a little splash of milk might fall into the beef stew. And what are you going to do about that? And so the rabbis had a long discussion, pages and pages of discussion about what you do in this instance. And what the ultimate decision was, if it's a 60th in weight and size or less, it doesn't actually exist and you can just eat it anyway. But that kind of picayune, sort of legalistic pull pill, it was fascinating to the rabbis. They found that exercise to be really engaging. The rest of folks who, just wanted to know what they needed to do to live a decent life and go on with life found it far less satisfying.
It wasn't spiritual.
It wasn't spiritual. So, which is why you see, you see at different times, and I'll get to it as we go on, Kabbalah and variations of Kabbalah really push in at different points in history, and it is often in response to very legalistic or rationalistic ways of looking at God. Okay, So we're going to get into the intellectual Middle Ages. So it's kind of a fascinating time, in part because all of a sudden around the 10th century, everybody was beginning to get access to translations of ancient Greek philosophy. The reason for that was there was a very progressive caliph, Muslim caliph, that wanted to catalog all of the wisdom literature of the world. And so they went about translating all of the wisdom literature of the world into Arabic, which most folks, whether they were Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, could read at that time. If you were scholars, could read at that time. So suddenly they could read Aristotle and Plato, and boy, were they intrigued. And not just Jewish thinkers. I mean, Muslim and Christian especially, folks were really just enamored with Greek philosophy. So in the Middle Ages, several Jewish thinkers really tried very hard to show that Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle was the fave. I'm personally more of a Plato person myself, but to each his own. Especially Aristotle wanted to show that Aristotle and Judaism were actually compatible, that there was no conflict between this philosophy they were so enamored with and this religion they were so dedicated to. They were trying to show that they were in concert and not in conflict. It's a hard sell, but they worked really hard at it. The two most prominent thinkers were Saadia Gaon, who was 10th century, and Maimonides, who was about 100 years later, 11th century. So for the Jewish philosophers of this period, divinity was completely transcendent, which becomes really problematic very quickly. Maimonides, who is considered our greatest medieval thinker, developed what's called negative theology. And his premise was there was no way, God was so far removed from us, so distant, that there was no way that we could even begin to consider who and what God was. All we could do was describe what God is not, which is negative theology. So God is not petty. God is not, I don't know, think of an unpleasant characteristic, and Maimonides would say, yes, God is not X. In fact, Maimonides, his term for divinity was supreme intellect. For Maimonides, who was a very brilliant and very egotistical philosopher. I mean, I struggle with Maimonides because he is certain he is right, without any question, always. And as I'm from modernity, I find that a little off-putting. But for him, divinity is supreme intellect. I mean, that's so far removed we can't embrace, even begin to see, and is simply nothing more or less than absolute intellect. Does that sound satisfying? Is that like, if your heart is breaking, is that the God you want to pray to? I mean, and I mean that really seriously. It's, I would find it, that is not the God that I adhere to. And the sense that what Maimonides and these philosophers miss is the emotional need people have for divinity. And you'll have to forgive me, my previous incarnation was as a psychologist, and I always kind of look at the world from that vantage point. But I believe that the reason that Kabbalah grows so ferociously is because it is so spiritually comforting and spiritually empowering. Whereas God is a supreme intellect who has no impact in history and doesn't care about you, which is really the Maimonides' God. God is so far removed, God has no interest in him, what's going on down here, is not a God that many people can go to in their broken moments. And that doesn't discount Maimonides is brilliant, and he truly was, but emotionally a little stilted. So we have the rise of Kabbalah, which starts happening. So Kabbalah, well, actually, let's forget that I clearly didn't change the top of the slide, so this is incorrect. Everything down here is correct. So this should say Kabbalah, some catchy subline, which I just forgot to put in my slide, so my apologies. This is from, I duplicate my slides and then change them so that the formatting stays the same, and didn't get that far. So Kabbalah really, first, there has been a mystical trend within Judaism from the time of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel. In fact, much of our mystical literature, much of our mystical approach begins with Merkaba theology, which is a chariot theology. I know that's not going to make a lot of sense. Ezekiel writes about a vision he has of God in a chariot, and it sort of is the beginning of our mystical tradition. But it really doesn't take off in any real sense, substantial sense, until the 13th century, where the Zohar, which is the Book of Radiance, was discovered by Rabbi Moshe de Leon. Actually, it was written by Rabbi Moshe de Leon and his disciples, and he wrote it as attempting to be in the voice of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a rabbi from the 2nd century. Anybody, if you've ever heard a story about a rabbi who spent 12 years in a cave with his son eating carob, that's Shimon ben Yochai. So with the Zohar, interest in Jewish mysticism kind of exploded. But it was always studied by a set of elite Jewish thinkers. So the thinkers that were really engaging in sort of the esoteric mind play, I guess, like you can kind of fall into Kabbalistic three-dimensional puzzle game in your head sometimes. I'm not sure if that's explaining things. There are details and intricacies that can be very interesting to delve into and study. And that's what the elite Jewish scholars did. The major themes in the Zohar include the nature of God in the cosmos, the creation of the world, the relationship of God to the world through Sefirot, the nature of evil and sin, and the major focus is unification with divinity through contemplative practices, which are called dedichut, and they're meditative practices. Now think about this. If I was just talking about Maimonides with his negative theology in which God was supreme intellect and completely distant, would this kind of discussion fall into a Maimonidean framework, right? Like Maimonides isn't terribly interested in the creation of the world. He acknowledges that there's evil and sin, but it's to be punished, not to understand. And for Maimonides, you simply can't unify with divinity because divinity is so distant and simply intellect. So even at this early stage in the 13th century, these thinkers are pushing in a more imminent leaning direction in terms of theology. But that goes hog wild, kosher hog wild, with the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, so Luria is this fascinating guy. I love him. He's very interesting. So Luria was a mystic of Sfat, and if you took my Kabbalah class, then you know that it was in Sfat in the 16th century that Kabbalah just kind of exploded, and that it did so largely as a result of the Spanish expulsion. So the mystics who were really enjoying and learning and expanding the Zohar in Spain get expelled from Spain. Many of them go to Sfat, and it becomes this sort of mystics colony. Prior to the 16th century, Kabbalah was really an esoteric practice, and it was limited to intellectual elite. But Luria's creation myth makes all Jews participants in this cosmic drama, and I'm just going to give a real quick, condensed explanation of it. So in Luria's creation myth, in order to allow for creation to happen, the first thing God had to do was contract God's self, limit God's self, in order to give room for creation. And not only did God limit God's self, but God also divided God's self into attributes, which become the sphirot. So we have this limitation. And the idea was that these sphirot would all fill with divine light in a way that was easy and strong and powerful. But something goes wrong. And there's essentially a few of the sphirot basically can't hold divine light. They shatter, they're shards of divinity. They get trapped in what the Kabbalists call husks of evil, and they fall to earth. So now we have a divinity who is fractured. And in Lurianic Kabbalah, it is the job of every Jew to find these husks of divinity in every part of the world around us, in what we eat and what we do and who we say, and release those shards of divinity from those husks of evil so that divinity can be more greatly unified. So within Lurianic Kabbalah, these people who were so diminished from the expulsion come to a theology that is so empowered that God needs them to become whole again, which is a very immanence-focused theology, but it's also so much more satisfying. If you have just been expelled from your home and you are as downtrodden as can be, to look at life as God needs me here to be doing the work of the Jewish people in order for God to be okay, that is a very powerful, empowering theology. And I think much more satisfying to a greater number of people than God's a distant intellect who doesn't really give two hoots about what's going on down in the earth, which again is Maimonideism. So all Jews must work to release the shards of divinity that have fallen to earth. So we've got the intellectualism of the Middle Ages, and that gets really resisted with the Lurianic Kabbalah of really the Renaissance period. Any questions or thoughts, or is it making sense of this juxtaposition of immanence and transcendence and how theology changes as needs change. Is that making, okay. So I said that y'all hear about Hasidut. This is where we are. Hasidut, or the Hasidic movement, started with Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who is also known as the Baal Shem Tov, or the Besht, and began in the middle 1700s. You look perplexed. Okay. Please feel free, if you are perplexed, to just throw out a question. I'm fine with that. So the Besht, he was kind of this simple guy. His parents died when he was very young. He was a ward of the community, essentially, until he was a teenager. And then he started working as a teacher's assistant. And he was known for walking with the kids to the classroom and singing. They would follow him and he'd be singing songs, and he'd tell them stories. And there was this sense of, I mean, he was just an emotional healer, is the sense that I get from him. He really touched people in a very profound way, starting with little kids. And nobody really thought that he was brilliant at first, because he worked as a janitor, he worked as a teacher's assistant. He wasn't really doing much, except he studied Lurianic Kabbalah copiously. He just did it in nature by himself. A lot of his theology is about being in nature. So it starts with the Baal Shem Tov, and for the Hasidim, divinity is completely immanent, completely close, and personal God. And the Besht urged his followers to develop a personal relationship with divinity. And he didn't focus on Jewish law. So this is what makes him very different, right? His focus, he was a scholar, he knew law, he knew halakha, he knew the Talmud, but he did not put primacy on it. He did not see it as being the most important thing. For the Besht, the most important thing was that sense of closeness with divinity. And I think he really had much greater insight into human nature than those who were advocating for a more sterile approach to God. So the interesting thing about the Hasidic movement is it basically takes Lurianic Kabbalah, that is this highly cosmic, magnificent, huge theology that's about unifying God so that we can get closer and closer to God, and internalizes it and psychologicalizes it. I know that's not a word, but it does convey what I'm trying to say. It makes it a personal endeavor instead of a communal one. So the focus becomes how do I reach a state where I can engage in devikut. Devikut is actually adherence. In fact, the word for tape in Israel has the same root as devikut, but it's how can I best adhere to God? And the way to do that is through ecstatic prayer, it's through meditation, it's through being in nature. These were the sort of the milieu for this movement. So the Hasidim personalizes and internalizes the cosmic drama. A couple of other things about Hasidut. So the Rabbi becomes very important. And everybody know what a Rabbi is? Yes, no, okay. So a Rebbe is in Jewish sects, in communities that are insular, a Rebbe is the leader, and and it's always a he, and he takes on sort of just beneath God's status. In fact, the Chabad Rebbe who died, I believe, in 92, Schneerson, folks were convinced he was the Messiah. His death kind of made that a little problematic. But that is the sort of the emotional cachet that's given by a Rebbe's people to the Rebbe. There's a focus on ecstatic prayer instead of Talmud study and halakha. That's not to say that Hasidim don't study Talmud. They do. It's just, it's not the most important thing. This is the most important thing. Ecstatic prayer, ecstatic connection with divinity is the most important thing. Other ultra-Orthodox sects that are not Hasidic in nature have a much greater focus on Talmud study and halakha, but the Hasidim really focus on prayer. I don't even know where I am. Okay. Actually, okay. Before we go on to the next section, any thoughts about, now, something about Hasidut. It's beautiful theology. There's a focus on transmitting moral ideas through storytelling, which is incredibly powerful. And it is my go-to place when I have to write a sermon or I'm trying to think of something a kavanah of some sort. It's beautiful, connected, lovely theology. And you don't have to be a part of a Hasidic sect to access the theology. There's a new Hasidim movement that is quite prolific. There's a lot of writing out there. Arthur Green, if you're interested in any of that theology, has written a couple of books called The New Hasidim and a follow-up to it. But it's mamale theology. It's the kind of theology that makes you feel like you've crawled into a lap and are being comforted. I'm not sure that I work with children. I've worked with children most of my career, so sometimes the things I think to say probably would be more appropriate for youngins. But I would really recommend, if you are feeling a little bereft, if you're feeling a little distant from divinity, go find read one of Arthur Green's books, because it's a salve on the soul. It's lovely, lovely theology. Okay, I should have a little commentary sign. I find it lovely, lovely theology. You can decide for your own self. With modernity, again, just as with the destruction of the Second Temple, everything gets kind of turned on its head. With the Enlightenment, so the Enlightenment brought emancipation for the first time. For the first time, Jews across Europe were able to leave their ghettos and were allowed legally to participate in the greater culture. And now that Jews could legally integrate, there was a tremendous desire to socially integrate, right? It's one thing to be able to legally hold a job. It's another to be treated as an equal by your Christian neighbors. And so with the emancipation, which came because of the Enlightenment, there was a mass exodus from Judaism, like really for the first time. It was the first time that you had a mass of people leave Judaism without being compelled to do so. Like, for instance, the Spanish expulsion around that time, a lot of people converted to Christianity because they wanted to stay living in Spain. That's not the same thing. In this case, there were a lot of people who relinquished their Jewish identity in order to have greater access into the predominantly Christian environments. So all of this desire to fit in, I think that's really what it comes down to, is a desire to be accepted and fit in the greater society. And all of these changes in modernity created the atmosphere where the reform movement could take hold. And so I want to talk a second about movements, because some of you who've heard me speak before may have heard me say that I consider myself a post-denominational rabbi. I was ordained in the reform movement, but it was very much a struggle for me between the conservative movement and the reform movement. And I chose the reform movement only because I didn't want to be the first queer person going through the conservative movement's rabbinic school. And because, I'd done that in my 20s, I didn't need to do that again. I think that at this point, denominations were acutely important at the time that they came into being, because they gave Judaism the opportunity to evolve and to modernize, and Judaism needed to modernize in some respects. I think at this point in history, the denominations do us more harm than good. That's just my opinion, commentary. You do not have to agree with me. But we are such a small people, and the denominations have created an environment where we don't have to interact with each other, and therefore we don't have to accept differences. And there was a much greater acceptance of differences within communities prior to the rise of denominations than there is today. And so at this point, I think they needed to happen. I'm not sure that they're awesome anymore, but again, that's just my opinion. So the Reform movement was born of an attempt to reconcile Judaism with contemporary life and to harmonize it with the emerging currents in Western thought. The first Reform temple was founded in 1818 in Hamburg, Germany. Most of Reform started in Germany, but it really took off when it came to the US. It's the largest denomination in the United States, and went like wildfire here. Less so in Europe and much less so in Israel. So one of the things that Reform movement did theologically was loosen the hold of Jewish law. So up until this point in history, the expectation was, whether you followed it or not, Jewish law was the right answer. Whatever the halakha was, it was the answer that should be. And what Reform said is halakha absolutely needs to inform our decisions, but not veto them, because it was, the Talmud was written 5th century. There are ways in which it is no longer applicable in our modern time. And so what the Reform movement said was, we will always, like a lot of people think that Reform movement just jettisoned halakha. That is not accurate, though some congregants certainly navigate the world as if it is. But the idea was, when making decisions, look to the halakha. If it makes sense within the modern framework, then it should take precedence. But if it doesn't, then it's allowed to be jettisoned. Now, that was the initial sort of attitude that went a little wonky when it got to the US. Because so one of the reasons why we even have a conservative movement is some folks looked at, in, I think it was, I want to say 1863, somewhere around there. The first Reformed seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio is constructed. They have their first banquet to congratulate all of their very first class of rabbis, and they serve shellfish and frog's legs. It ended up being called the Treif banquet, right? That's, for any of you who don't know, treif literally means torn animal, but in Jewish vernacular means anything that's not kosher. And like everything on the menu was a no-no in terms of halakha. And so a lot of, for many Jews, that was too far and too much. And for many Jews, Reform Jews today, that perspective is too far and too much. Reform Judaism has actually gotten more traditional over time. Baruch Hashem, I'm very happy that that's the case. I'm very attached to tradition. So Reform Judaism's gotten more traditional over time, but it started out, at least in this country, going kashrut laws, you know, that, which creates tension. Again, this creates a kind of tension, and a whole bunch of folks went, that's not, I can't be a happy, satisfied Jew eating frog legs, you know, like denying what I've been taught is right. I don't feel good about that. It's not okay, you know, whatever the explanation is. And it was a real motivating factor in the development of the conservative movement. So, so the Reform movement puts more emphasis on moral, ethical halakha than it does on ritual laws. And that is one thing that you will see across denominations. You can't focus entirely on everything. It's kind of Judaism is a big, wielding, multi-level thing that you can't do all of it all the time. And so in your more, you know, like your modern Orthodox shuls tend to focus more on ritual observance. Your Reform Jews shuls tend to really focus more on ethical, moral observance. It's not to say that either one of those don't focus on the other. It's where they put their emphasis. And in Reform, the emphasis is on moral, ethical laws. And, you know, the Reform movement originally was called the prophetic movement, based on the prophets of the Tanakh. And all of the prophets of the Tanakh, almost all of them, were talking not about ritual observance, but about moral responsibility. So Reform began as an anti-Zionist movement. It changed with the Shoah for obvious reasons. And it tends to be the most innovative of the three main denominations. It's, you know, willing to try new things. They were the first to ordain women and the first to ordain queer people, and you know, the first to provide forums for deaf and blind people to become rabbis. I mean, there's a tendency to be more innovative. I was ordained in the Reform movement. I think that's all lovely, and it's often uncomfortable for me. I mean, I find some of that innovation a little uncomfortable, but I also think it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. The conservative movement began as a way to conserve traditional Judaism in the face of the liberal tendencies of Reform leaders, right? Like the Treif banquet was too much, and so there was a desire to pull back. And Reform's minimizing of halakha was one of the reasons for the development of the conservative movement. And it attempts to balance Jewish law and modernity. I don't think it does a great job, frankly, and this is coming from a very personal place. In writing my book, I wrote on all of the major, so what my book does is trace all of the commentary across 2,500 years on the rape of Dinah story in Genesis 34. And I use the Genesis 34 as what I call a biblical Rorschach test, again, psychology background, and I analyze the projections that commentators make on the text and infer sort of social mores around women who've been violated. So that's my elevator pitch on that. But in writing this, one of the things I did was go through each of the modern denominations' Torah commentaries as well. And what I found with Etz Haim, which is the conservative movement's Chumash or Torah commentary, is when it came to the rape of Dinah, their methodology was to adhere to the rabbis. That they kind of pin themselves in with that methodology. They have to adhere to the rabbis, which frankly discounts 1,000 years of commentary, because the rabbis ended around the 7th, 8th century, right? And we got a lot of commentary since then. So in the rape of Dinah story, their commentary is kind of, well, she probably was responsible for her violation because the rabbis say she was, but we don't like having to say that. I mean, that's the attitude that came through, and it was like, oh, you guys, take a stand. I felt that they were really inhibited by their own methodology. And again, and I've spent most of my life in conservative shuls. That's probably where I'm most comfortable. So I'm not disparaging them. It's just in terms of this balancing Jewish law and modernity component, I'm not sure that the conservative movement is meeting their own desires there. But, take that for what it's worth. And lastly, we have Orthodox movements. And movements because there are lots of different sects within ultra-Orthodoxy. There's a lot going on under the Orthodox umbrella. In modern Orthodoxy tends to focus on maintaining Jewish law while also integrating into modern society, so sort of the conservative attempt. The ultra-Orthodox Hasidic sects, and there are many of them, the most prominent or the most well-known is the Chabad. They focus on Hasidut mystical theology and withdrawing from modern society. That's with the exception of Chabad. Chabad actually is much more in modern society than the rest of the sects. Ultra-Orthodox non-Hasidic sects focus almost entirely on Talmud and Jewish law and also withdrawing from modern society. So I recognize the movements. I'm not giving theology as much, but as sort of the directions that these movements were going. One thing I want to say before I wrap up is I left off a whole bunch. And what I really left off were the existential theologians / philosophers that rose between the First and Second World Wars. That would be Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and to a lesser degree Emmanuel Levinas. Their theology is stunning, but would take a class to, like an entire unit to unravel, so it didn't make sense to include it. But if you have any interest in these modern theologies, medieval and modern theology is my area of expertise. I'd be happy to point you in direction of books that might be of interest. So that's my last slide.